Risk of Rain 2 has a huge problem. For a game that's continually being updated and expanded upon, it's inevitable for issues such as power creep and massive loot pools to have a negative impact on the game. We've already seen the effects of this to some degree with Survivors of the Void, and these are problems that will only get worse with future expansions. Today I want to talk about some concerns I have about the game, and some ways these problems are being fixed. Let's start with power creep. You may have heard this term thrown around in various places. In short, games that are expanded upon and updated on a regular basis have to constantly add bigger and better content to get people's attention. But a natural consequence of this is older content then becomes much weaker in comparison, as the next big thing will always take center stage. Power creep is something that can be found in all forms of media, movies, video games, anime, Funko Pops, you name it. It's something that's kind of unavoidable. Bigger threats, bigger stakes, and more powerful solutions is required for keeping an audience's interest. But before I get any deeper, I'm going to play a clip from the recent Dev Thoughts where they were asked about it.
What are the team's thoughts, if any, on the state of power creep in the game? Items and characters, and in the expansion, some enemies appear to be consistently ramping up their power level, leaving a handful of older content in the past. Characters like Railgunner, Loader, or even Acrid completely blow others like Huntress out of the water in a lot of ways. And items like Raincoat, RIP, old Raincoat, and Lost Seers are incredibly powerful compared to anything we've had before. So yeah, power creep.
So I would say two things. I don't want to diminish their experience, but like, are they actually weaker though? You know? Like some of the older items are boring or maybe more stock. I would argue that the newer ones are more conditional and aren't necessarily stronger. I would say there is definitely some standouts for survivors though. Like we all know Loader's like a blade broken, right? Like it's just completely busted. And I think that leads into the second point, which is this is a game you just play for fun. It is not a competitive game. It is not a ranked game. And so the most important thing is our characters balanced enough to still be fun. Our items balanced enough that they're still fun to get. And I would say the answer to that is yes.
For the most part, I would agree with this. I think power creep has really affected the new survivors in the expansion. I would say Railgunner and Void Fiend are easily top 3 survivors, but it doesn't really matter. It's not a competitive game, the roster isn't competing with itself, so adding a new overpowered survivor really has no bearing on the old ones. However, I would disagree with them on items. I think the items we got in the DLC were a step above what we've had in the past. Specifically, some of the Void items come to mind, especially Polyloot. The proc chain capability of that item and versatility is unlike anything we've ever seen. Also, watches just making any build better. There really aren't that many items from the DLC that are bad. Don't get me wrong, there are still a few stinkers in there, but for the most part my runs have been much better post-DLC. And that's not entirely because the new items are busted or more powerful. A large part of that is just the fact that there are more items, meaning more interactions and more things your character can do. A lot of the new items are only good because they interact with old items. The new items added didn't make the old items redundant. Loot is still random for the most part, and old items are just as important as ever, but what the DLC did do was make items as a whole stronger. If you remember a few weeks ago, I talked about damage scaling and how every time a new source of damage is introduced, it exponentially increases the power of the damage items you already have, and that's basically what the DLC did on a macro level. Now this is fine to some degree because it's been balanced with harder enemies. A lot of the weaker pre-expansion enemies like beetles are being phased out in favor of stronger alternatives like vermin and larvae. Blind pests are a force to be reckoned with. The grandparent rework was pretty rough. I could go on. I don't think the stronger enemies have quite balanced out the new items, but it certainly helped. Making harder enemies is really the only way I can think of to curb power creep. A big downside to doing so is it creates a bigger dependency on items. In the past, there were a few viable playstyles. I know I've talked about this a million times on this channel, so I won't dwell. Full looting, where you take your time and get every item on the stage. This results in stronger enemies, but having better loot to deal with it. And rushing, where you go through the stages quickly, only grabbing a few items. This results in weak enemies with the downside of you also being weak. But now, with both items and enemies getting a power boost, loot has become a lot more of a necessity. Dealing with these stronger threats requires stronger loot, and I think future expansions will make this discrepancy even more apparent. Rushing is still viable, and you can still have success with it, but I think the game has been moving away from it for a while now. With that being said, I am very biased. I'm a full looter to the extreme with a capital X. To bring it back, overall, I don't think power creep is that big of a deal. I think the much bigger issue comes down to the loot pool. If you've ever played this game with a ridiculous amount of mods, you know there seems to be a limit to how much content this game can have without feeling bloated. Every time you add a new item to the game, you make all the other items in that tier rarer. And if you keep adding items, eventually you'll reach a breaking point where the game just isn't satisfying anymore. There's too much loot to get, and the game just feels like a bloated mess. So you can probably forgive me for being a little bit concerned about this expansion with 40 items being introduced to the loot pool, but Hopu know their shit, and we're able to curb this issue in a couple of ways. For one, void items are genius. They're a separate rarity and corrupt already existing items. This was a very creative way of adding items without actually expanding the loot pool. You have to let go of an item to gain an item. It's like when I tell my grandson to get rid of all of his old Funko Pops so he can make room for all the new Fortnite Funko Pops coming his way. Another way they tried to fix this was by adding items that serve the same function. Best example being Mocha, which is half syringe, half goat hoof. You no longer rely on finding hooves/syringes for your build. Mocha was really the only item we saw like this, and I'm willing to bet we'll see more of this type of item in future expansions. Another thing Hopu did to fix this was adding items that let you get other items. Items like regenerating scrap, shipping requests, and encrusted/rusted keys. These items' effects allow you to get more items down the road. They take up a slot but don't really detract from the loot pool. They're items you invest in and act more like stocks than items. I think there's probably a limit to how many items like this you can have, but nonetheless it's a very clever solution. As far as white and green items go, I don't think it's had a huge impact. The most notable things I think have changed is the viability of bleed and Hopu feathers. Bleed is rare now, and because of that it's much harder to stack and get a solid bleed build going without a printer. But then again, things like Mocha and watches have also buffed Bleed's viability. Feathers, on the other hand, don't really have a replacement outside of Head Stompers, which is a red item. I feel like Feather is kind of a staple, but post-DLC they're much harder to find. But most affected are red items, which are already really rare. Pre-DLC there were 20 reds, and now there's 26. This means you'll have a 25% harder time finding the red you want. The new large category chests have resolved this issue a little bit, but not really. All these solutions are very clever and do curb this issue, but I do think the loot pool getting too big is an issue that can't ever be fully solved. There are systems in place that limit it, but I think there will be an inevitable breaking point where the game just doesn't have room for more loot, at least in the basic tiers. With that said, I am confident in Hopu games, and I hope this video didn't come off as fear-mongering. Now, I'm sure I'm forgetting something, and if you have anything to add, drop a comment. This is a topic that is endlessly fascinating to me, and it'd be cool to get a discussion going. Let me know what you thought of the video, leave a like if you enjoyed, and go ahead and hit that grand fam button so I can afford new Funko Pops for my grandson. That's all for now.